Yeah, so we will expand now further on the subject of criminality of nuclear weapons. And even in the current law, criminality of nuclear weapons is quite well described. And in this matter, I wanted to address the materials of Francis Boyle in Waging Peace series, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation material, where he is talking also about Nuremberg responsibility. As a lawyer, he is reminding us that we are compelled by the Nuremberg principles to point out the inescapable conclusions of law to all government decision makers in the nuclear weapons states. And first, according to the Nuremberg judgment, soldiers would be obliged to disobey egregiously illegal orders with respect to launching and waging a nuclear war. Second, all government officials and military officers who might nevertheless launch or wage a nuclear war will be personally responsible for the commission of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and Protocol 1, and genocide, among other international crimes. Third, such individuals would not be entitled to be to the defences of superior orders, act of state, to quote, self-defense, etc. Fourth, such individuals could thus be quite legitimately and most severely punished as war criminals, up to and including the imposition of the death penalty without limitation of time. So as you see, it is a bit odd how nuclear war is already sort of criminal act, but it is not criminalized. It is still an option for the government leaders. And he elaborates also on the threat to use nuclear weapons, where Article 2 of 4 of the United Nations Charter of 1945 prohibits both the threat and the use of force except in cases of legitimate self-defense as recognized by Article 51. Yeah, so this is like dilemma of moment 22. And very well is described also the human rights to anti-nuclear civil resistance, and the illegal status of nuclear arms. But nevertheless, the nuclear weapons are just getting more and more. The number of them is growing rapidly. And here is reachingcriticalwill.org document on filling the gap, the legal gap, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And this is the December 2014 conference on humanitarian impact on nuclear weapons in Vienna, Austria, that made a pledge calling on all states parties to the NPT to renew their commitment to Article 6 of the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. and to this end to identify and pursue effective measures to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. And you can see the structure of this process. It's ordered in development, production, manufacture, in testing, transfer or acquisition, transit, stockpiling, possession, stationing, deployment, use and threat of use, assistance with prohibited acts including financing, rights and restoration. And the other axis of this systemic analysis is existing law and gaps in the existing law. So it's very properly done, very nice analysis. And you can find it on reachingcriticalwill.org. And they are complaining about that there is no international legal instrument that provides a framework for victims and survivors of nuclear weapons collectively to seek assistance towards full realization of their rights. And existing provisions on assistance, encouragement and inducement are uneven and do not apply equally to all states. And NPT, nuclear armed states parties may assist each other or states not party to the NPT in the production of nuclear weapons. And there is no explicit treaty prohibition against financing of the production, maintenance or modernization of nuclear weapon systems. And companies in non-nuclear armed states are currently contributing to the modernization of nuclear arsenals. And many more. So there is an ongoing work being done in this issue, but what is my task here? My task here is still again to remind you that this job has to be done, but we can do it well only if we describe the full matrix of nuclear war system. It cannot be done by just eliminating nuclear weapons and prohibiting them and dismantling them and even taking care of the nuclear waste, because that could be also one way to just colonize the nations left without nuclear weapons. We have to have an approach that is systemically wide, and this is what we're doing here, and we will provide it. Because the war is being globalized, and that is both talking of the Third World War, that the elites are planning for the finalization of the New World Order project, and also the nuclear weapons they are using in the shock doctrine for the people to submit to the New World Order. And as the final talker of the day, I introduce Michael Czosudowski to tell us on the globalization of the war.
Future of humanity. This is not an understatement. It is not something necessarily which is... I think the world is presently at the crossroads of the most serious crisis in modern history. The United States and its indefectible British ally have launched a military adventure which threatens the future of humanity. This is not an understatement. It is not something necessarily which is portrayed in the mainstream media, because war in the mainstream media is portrayed as a humanitarian undertaking, as a peace-building, anti-terrorist operation. But in fact, if we look at recent developments, particularly with regard to the militarization of Eastern Europe, particularly the deployment of NATO forces on Russia's doorstep, the civil war which is occurring in Ukraine, but concurrently the wars in the Middle East, particularly the escalation which is currently occurring in Syria and Iraq, and the fact that that whole area now becomes an open border with the possibility of a regional war which would extend from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean right to Central Asia and South Asia, involving possibly other countries and leading to an integration of existing war theaters. We have a war in Iraq, we have a war in Syria, we have threats directed against Iran, we have a situation in Palestine which is part of this process. We have an undeclared war of the United States directed against Pakistan with the drone attacks in the northwest Pakistan, and at the same time the United States has deployed its military forces in virtually every region of the world with the regional command structures. US Pacific Command is in charge of the so-called Asia pivot, the pivot to Asia, which is part of the military agenda and which essentially consists in threatening China. We have a process of militarization in the South China Sea. At this very moment, the United States, with its allies, are building US-sponsored military facilities. I refer specifically to Jeju Island, which is located just opposite Shanghai, and where they're in the process of building a military base at this very moment. Legally, formally, it is part of the South Korean military arsenal, but in actual practice, it is a US military base because the United States also has a defense cooperation agreement with Korea. And in fact, we see the evolution of what we might call the globalization of war, where, first of all, the United States is using alliances, not only within NATO, but extending beyond NATO, to wage war on, or at least to threaten, a certain number of countries. But specifically, at this particular juncture, they are threatening Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and of course they're waging a war in Iraq and Syria. These are wars of conquest. They're not, they have nothing to do with going after the Islamic State rebels. And in fact, the whole justification for these wars borders on absurd, because we know, and it's well documented, that the ISIL, the Islamic State, is a construct of US intelligence. It was supported and financed by the United States and its allies, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, from the very outset of the war in Syria in March 2011. It was in fact built with a view to confronting the armed forces of the government of Bashar al-Assad. It was responsible for countless atrocities, and the architects of that Islamic State are, of course, the United States of America.
Okay, I will stop him here. Enough, he has sketched the picture. I will show you a video that I myself made in an interview with Agneta Norberg from Sweden, where she has made the material over NATO forces in United States. In the world, rather. This is video I filmed something like 7 years ago, or maybe 5.
Well, it's very important to understand how the US has surrounded the whole continent with about 1,000 military bases. And the military bases are also the raiders. You can see it up here in Norway, and you can see the Fauci raider base, and then it goes on with different kind of bases, and you can see Diego Garcia here, the most important attack launching base when they launched the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan. And here you have an Eastern NATO unfolding. Here in Alaska, they have Eielson Air Force Base, and from there they launched a huge Air Force attack or exercise, and even Sweden was taking part in this exercise. It's Japan, it's South Korea, it's the NATO countries, it's Australia who are in the East NATO. And here comes the South NATO with Chile, always cooperating with, and South Africa and Australia. It's the South to take on the South the Antarctic gas and oil. And here you have the North NATO. So all here are a lot of exercises going on, because here up in the north there are gas and oil under the ice. So if you want the other people to sign any treaties like no nuclear weapons convention, you have to understand that this is a stranglehold. The US bases are strangling the whole continent and telling other people what to do and not to do. So I think NATO has gone global. The nuclear weapons are deployed on Trident submarine. 8 submarines are always on patrol all over the world. It's also a stranglehold. You have the Trident here. And another thing I think we should observe is that now US has signed an agreement with Colombia to build 7 new military bases in Colombia. And what is that for? Because they are really scared for Venezuela and for Ecuador and for Bolivia, the leftist growing awareness. So US is not happy about that, so they have put these bases here. And the 4th Fleet is patrolling now around Latin America's coasts. So we have to be aware of the whole picture, and that all these bases, I'm finished soon. All these bases are for space war as well, like all those here. So you have to study this book, The Basis of Empire, and then you understand. And it's written by Catherine Lutz, a professor. So it's a very important book. Thank you very much.
Could you please say what your name is?
My name is Agneta Norberg, and I'm the Vice Chair of Swedish Peace Council and also the Board of the Directors in Global Against Nuclear Power and Weapons in Space. That's me.
Thank you.
Okay, that seems quite sort of depressing to see all these forces of the new empire, but generally they are all waiting for a systemic solution, because this monster that has been created by this empire is falling on themselves, because they want to live too, and the system has gone out of control. But tomorrow we will be discussing how to get control over this troublesome situation and what lovely systems to put into place. And we will manage to do this by the simple methodology of letting each existing unit to decentrifuge itself. by putting some existential laws that have to be followed. Stay with us on day 5 tomorrow. Thanks so much for today.